双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas de Quincey, being an extract from the life of a scholar. From the London Magazine for September 1821. To the reader, I here present you, courteous reader, with the record of a remarkable period in my life, according to my application of it. I trust that it will prove not merely an interesting record, but in a considerable degree useful and instructive. In that hope it is that I have drawn it up, and that must be my apology for breaking through that delicate and honorable reserve which, for the most part, restrains us from the public exposure of our own errors and infirmities. Nothing, indeed, is more revolting to English feelings than the spectacle of a human being obtruding on our notice his moral ulcers or scars, and tearing away that decent drapery which time or indulgence to human frailty may have drawn over them. Accordingly, the greater part of our confessions, that is, spontaneous and extrajudicial confessions, proceed from demireps, adventurers, or swindlers, and for any such acts of gratuitous self-humiliation from those who can be supposed in sympathy with the decent and self-respecting part of society, we must look to French literature, or to that part of the German which is tainted with the spurious and defective sensibility of the French. All this I feel so forcibly, and so nervously am I alive to reproach of this tendency, that I have for many months hesitated about the propriety of allowing this or any part of my narrative to come before the public eye until after my death, when, for many reasons, the whole will be published. And it is not without an anxious review of the reasons for and against the step that I have at last concluded on taking it. Guilt and misery shrink, by a natural instinct, from public notice. They court privacy and solitude, and even in their choice of a grave will sometimes sequester themselves from the general population of the churchyard, as if declining to claim fellowship with the great family of man, and wishing, in the affecting language of Mr. Wordsworth, humbly to express a penitential loneliness. It is well, upon the whole, and for the interest of us all, that it should be so. Nor would I willingly in my own person manifest a disregard of such salutary feelings, nor in act or word do anything to weaken them. But, on the one hand, as my self-accusation does not amount to a confession of guilt, so, on the other, it is possible that, if it did, the benefit resulting to others from the record of an experience purchased at so heavy a price might compensate, by a vast overbalance, for any violence done to the feelings I have noticed, and justify a breach of the general rule. Infirmity and misery do not of necessity imply guilt. They approach or recede from shades of that dark alliance, in proportion to the probable motives and prospects of the offender, and the palliations, known or secret, of the offense, in proportion as the temptations to it were potent from the first, and the resistance to it, in act or in effort, was earnest to the last. For my own part, without breach of truth or modesty, I may affirm that my life has been, on the whole, the life of a philosopher. From my birth, I was made an intellectual creature, and intellectual in the highest sense my pursuits and pleasures have been, even from my schoolboy days. If opium eating be a sensual pleasure, and if I am bound to confess that I have indulged in it to an excess not yet recorded one of any other man, it is no less true that I have struggled against this fascinating enthrallment with a religious zeal, and have at length accomplished what I never yet heard attributed to any other man have untwisted, almost to its final links, the accursed chain which fettered me. Such a self-conquest may reasonably be set off in counterbalance to any kind or degree of self-indulgence. Not to insist that in my case the self-conquest was unquestionable, the self-indulgence open to doubts of casuistry, according as that name shall be extended to acts aiming at the bare relief of pain, or shall be restricted to such as aim at the excitement of positive pleasure. Guilt, therefore, I do not acknowledge, and if I did, it is possible that I might still resolve on the present act of confession in consideration of the service which I may thereby render to the whole class of opium eaters. But who are they? Reader, I am sorry to say, a very numerous class indeed. Of this I became convinced some years ago by computing at that time the number of those in one small class of English society, the class of men distinguished for talents, or of eminent station who were known to me, directly or indirectly, as opium eaters. Such, for instance, as the eloquent and benevolent Dash, the late Dean of Dash, Lord Dash, Mr. the philosopher, a late Under-Secretary of State, who described to me the sensation which first drove him to the use of opium in the very same words as the Dean of Dash, viz., that he felt as though rats were gnawing and abrading the coats of his stomach. Mr. Dash, and many others hardly less known, whom it would be tedious to mention. Now, if one class, comparatively so limited, could furnish so many scores of cases, and that within the knowledge of one single inquirer, it was a natural inference that the entire population of England would furnish a proportionable number. The soundness of this inference, however, I doubted, until some facts became known to me which satisfied me that it was not incorrect. I will mention, too, 3 respectable London druggists, in widely remote quarters of London, from whom I happened lately to be purchasing small quantities of opium, assured me that the number of amateur opium eaters, as I may term them, was at this time immense, and that the difficulty of distinguishing those persons to whom habit had rendered opium necessary from such as were purchasing it with a view to suicide occasioned them daily trouble and disputes. This evidence respected London only. But, too, which will possibly surprise the reader more some years ago, on passing through Manchester, I was informed by several cotton manufacturers that their workpeople were rapidly getting into the practice of opium eating. So much so, that on a Saturday afternoon the counters of the druggists were strewed with pills of 1, 2, or 3 grains, in preparation for the known demand of the evening. The immediate occasion of this practice was the lowness of wages, which at that time would not allow them to indulge in ale or spirits, and wages rising, it may be thought that this practice would cease, but as I do not readily believe that any man having once tasted the divine luxuries of opium will afterwards descend to the gross and mortal enjoyments of alcohol, I take it for granted that those eat now who never ate before, and those who always ate now eat the more. Indeed, the fascinating powers of opium are admitted even by medical writers, who are its greatest enemies. Thus, for instance, Ausider, apothecary to Greenwich Hospital, in his essay on the effects of opium, published in the year 1763, when attempting to explain why Mead had not been sufficiently explicit on the properties, counteragents, and of this drug, expresses himself in the following mysterious terms, Greek text. Perhaps he thought the subject of too delicate a nature to be made common, and, as many people might then indiscriminately use it, it would take from that necessary fear and caution which should prevent their experiencing the extensive power of this drug, for there are many properties in it, if universally known, that would habituate the use, and make it more in request with us than with Turks themselves, the result of which knowledge, he adds, must prove a general misfortune. In the necessity of this conclusion I do not altogether concur, but upon that point I shall have occasion to speak at the close of my confessions, where I shall present the reader with the moral of my narrative. Preliminary confessions. These preliminary confessions, or introductory narrative of the youthful adventures which laid the foundation of the writer's habit of opium eating in after life, it has been judged proper to premise, for 3 several reasons. 1. As forestalling that question, and giving it a satisfactory answer, which else would painfully obtrude itself in the course of the opium confessions. How came any reasonable being to subject himself to such a yoke of misery, voluntarily to incur a captivity so servile, and knowingly to fetter himself with such a 7-fold chain? A question which, if not somewhere plausibly resolved, could hardly fail, by the indignation which it would be apt to raise as against an act of wanton folly, to interfere with that degree of sympathy which is necessary in any case to an author's purposes. Point 2. As furnishing a key to some parts of that tremendous scenery which afterwards peopled the dreams of the opium eater. 3. As creating some previous interest of a personal sort in the confessing subject, apart from the matter of the confessions, which cannot fail to render the confessions themselves more interesting. If a man whose talk is of oxen should become an opium eater, the probability is that if he is not too dull to dream at all, he will dream about oxen. Whereas, in the case before him, the reader will find that the opium eater boasteth himself to be a philosopher, and accordingly, that the phantasmagoria of his dreams, waking or sleeping, daydreams or night dreams, is suitable to one who in that character, humani nihil a esse alienum putat. For amongst the conditions which he deems indispensable to the sustaining of any claim to the title of philosopher is not merely the possession of a superb intellect in its analytic functions, in which part of the pretensions, however, England can for some generations show but few claimants. At least, he is not aware of any known candidate for this honor who can be styled emphatically a subtle thinker, with the exception of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and in a narrower department of thought with the recent illustrious exception, too, of David Ricardo, but also on such a constitution of the moral faculties as shall give him an inner eye and power of intuition for the vision and the mysteries of our human nature. That constitution of faculties, in short, which, amongst all the generations of men that from the beginning of time have deployed into life, as it were, upon this planet, our English poets have possessed in the highest degree, and Scottish professors in the lowest. I have often been asked how I first came to be a regular opium eater, and have suffered, very unjustly, in the opinion of my acquaintance, from being reputed to have brought upon myself all the sufferings which I shall have to record, by a long course of indulgence in this practice purely for the sake of creating an artificial state of pleasurable excitement. This, however, is a misrepresentation of my case. True it is that for nearly 10 years I did occasionally take opium for the sake of the exquisite pleasure it gave me. But so long as I took it with this view, I was effectually protected from all material bad consequences by the necessity of interposing long intervals between the several acts of indulgence, in order to renew the pleasurable sensations. It was not for the purpose of creating pleasure, but of mitigating pain in the severest degree, that I first began to use opium as an article of daily diet. In the 28th year of my age, a most painful affection of the stomach, which I had first experienced about 10 years before, attacked me in great strength. This affection had originally been caused by extremities of hunger, suffered in my boyish days, during the season of hope and redundant happiness which succeeded, that is, from 18 to 24, it had slumbered. For the 3 following years it had revived at intervals, and now, under unfavorable circumstances, from depression of spirits, it attacked me with a violence that yielded to no remedies but opium. As the youthful sufferings which first produced this derangement of the stomach were interesting in themselves, and in the circumstances that attended them, I shall here briefly retrace them. My father died when I was about 7 years old, and left me to the care of 4 guardians. I was sent to various schools, great and small, and was very early distinguished for my classical attainments, especially for my knowledge of Greek. At 13 I wrote Greek with ease, and at 15 my command of that language was so great that I not only composed Greek verses in lyric meters, but could converse in Greek fluently and without embarrassment, an accomplishment which I have not since met with in any scholar of my times, and which in my case was owing to the practice of daily reading off the newspapers into the best Greek I could furnish extempore, for the necessity of ransacking my memory and invention for all sorts and combinations of periphrastic expressions as equivalents for modern ideas, images, relations of things, and gave me a compass of diction which would never have been called out by a dull translation of moral essays. And that boy, said one of my masters, pointing the attention of a stranger to me. That boy could harangue an Athenian mob better than you, and I could address an English one. He who honored me with this eulogy was a scholar, and a ripe and a good one, and of all my tutors was the only one whom I loved or reverenced. Unfortunately for me, and, as I afterwards learned, to this worthy man's great indignation, I was transferred to the care, first of a blockhead, who was in a perpetual panic lest I should expose his ignorance, and finally to that of a respectable scholar at the head of a great school on an ancient foundation. This man had been appointed to his situation by college, Oxford, and was a sound, well-built scholar, but, like most men whom I have known from that college, coarse, clumsy, and inelegant. A miserable contrast he presented, in my eyes, to the Etonian brilliancy of my favorite master, and beside, he could not disguise from my hourly notice the poverty and meagerness of his understanding. It is a bad thing for a boy to be, and to know himself far beyond his tutors, whether in knowledge or in power of mind. This was the case, so far as regarded knowledge at least, not with myself only, for the two boys, who jointly with myself composed the first form, were better Grecians than the headmaster, though not more elegant scholars, nor at all more accustomed to sacrifice to the graces. When I first entered, I remember that we read Sophocles, and it was a constant matter of triumph to us, the learned triumvirate of the first form, to see our Archididascalus, as he loved to be called, conning our lessons before we went up, and laying a regular train, with lexicon and grammar, for blowing up and blasting, as it were, any difficulties he found in the choruses, whilst we never condescended to open our books until the moment of going up, and were generally employed in writing epigrams upon his wig, or some such important matter. My two classfellows were poor, and dependent for their future prospects at the university on the recommendation of the headmaster. But I, who had a small patrimonial property, the income of which was sufficient to support me at college, wished to be sent thither immediately. I made earnest representations on the subject to my guardians, but all to no purpose. One, who was more reasonable and had more knowledge of the world than the rest, lived at a distance. Two of the other three resigned all their authority into the hands of the fourth, and this fourth, with whom I had to negotiate, was a worthy man in his way, but haughty, obstinate, and intolerant of all opposition to his will. After a certain number of letters and personal interviews, I found that I had nothing to hope for, not even a compromise of the matter. From my guardian, unconditional submission was what he demanded, and I prepared myself, therefore, for other measures. Summer was now coming on with hasty steps, and my 17th birthday was fast approaching, after which day I had sworn within myself that I would no longer be numbered among schoolboys. Money being what I chiefly wanted, I wrote to a woman of high rank, who, though young herself, had known me from a child, and had latterly treated me with great distinction, requesting that she would lend me 5 guineas. For upwards of a week no answer came, and I was beginning to despond, when at length a servant put into my hands a double letter with a coronet on the seal. The letter was kind and obliging. The fair writer was on the sea-coast, and in that way the delay had arisen. She enclosed double of what I had asked, and good-naturedly hinted that if I should never repay her, it would not absolutely ruin her. Now, then, I was prepared for my scheme. 10 guineas, added to about 2 which I had remaining from my pocket money, seemed to me sufficient for an indefinite length of time, and at that happy age, if no definite boundary can be assigned to one's power, the spirit of hope and pleasure makes it virtually infinite. It is a just remark of Dr. Johnson's, and, what cannot often be said of his remarks, it is a very feeling one, that we never do anything consciously for the last time, of things, that is, which we have long been in the habit of doing, without sadness of heart. This truth I felt deeply when I came to leave a place which I did not love, and where I had not been happy, on the evening before I left, forever. I grieved when the ancient and lofty schoolroom resounded with the evening service, performed for the last time in my hearing. And at night, when the muster roll of names was called over, and mine, as usual, was called first, I stepped forward, and passing the headmaster, who was standing by, I bowed to him and looked earnestly in his face, thinking to myself, "He is old and infirm, and in this world I shall not see him again." I was right. I never did see him again, nor ever shall. He looked at me complacently, smiled good-naturedly, returned my salutation, or rather my valediction, and we parted, though he knew it not, forever. I could not reverence him intellectually, but he had been uniformly kind to me, and had allowed me many indulgences, and I grieved at the thought of the mortification I should inflict upon him. The morning came which was to launch me into the world, and from which my whole succeeding life has in many important points taken its coloring. I lodged in the headmaster's house, and had been allowed for my first entrance the indulgence of a private room, which I used both as a sleeping room and as a study. At half after 3 I rose, and gazed with deep emotion at the ancient towers of Drayest in earliest light, and beginning to crimson with the radiant luster of a cloudless July morning. I was firm and immovable in my purpose, but yet agitated by anticipation of uncertain danger and troubles. And if I could have foreseen the hurricane and perfect hailstorm of affliction which soon fell upon me, well might I have been agitated. To this agitation the deep peace of the morning presented an affecting contrast, and in some degree a medicine. The silence was more profound than that of midnight, and to me the silence of a summer morning is more touching than all other silence, because, the light being broad and strong as that of noonday at other seasons of the year, it seems to differ from perfect day chiefly because man is not yet abroad, and thus the peace of nature and of the innocent creatures of God seems to be secure and deep only so long as the presence of man and his restless and unquiet spirit are not there to trouble its sanctity. I dressed myself, took my hat and gloves, and lingered a little in the room. For the last year and a half this room had been my pensive citadel. Here I had read and studied through all the hours of night, and though true it was that for the latter part of this time I, who was framed for love and gentle affections, had lost my gaiety and happiness during the strife and fever of contention with my guardian, yet, on the other hand, as a boy so passionately fond of books, and dedicated to intellectual pursuits, I could not fail to have enjoyed many happy hours in the midst of general dejection. I wept as I looked round on the chair, hearth, writing table, and other familiar objects, knowing too certainly that I looked upon them for the last time. Whilst I write this it is 18 years ago, and yet at this moment I see distinctly, as if it were yesterday, the lineaments and expression of the object on which I fixed my parting gaze. It was a picture of the lovely dash, which hung over the mantelpiece, the eyes and mouth of which were so beautiful, and the whole countenance so radiant with benignity and divine tranquillity, that I had 1,000 times laid down my pen or my book to gather consolation from it, as a devotee from his patron saint. Whilst I was yet gazing upon it, the deep tones of clock proclaimed that it was 4 o'clock. I went up to the picture, kissed it, and then gently walked out and closed the door for ever. So blended and intertwisted in this life are occasions of laughter and of tears, that I cannot yet recall without smiling an incident which occurred at that time, and which had nearly put a stop to the immediate execution of my plan. I had a trunk of immense weight, for, besides my clothes, it contained nearly all my library. The difficulty was to get this removed to a carrier's. My room was at an aerial elevation in the house, and, what was worse, the staircase which communicated with this angle of the building was accessible only by a gallery, which passed the headmaster's chamber door. I was a favorite with all the servants, and knowing that any of them would screen me and act confidentially, I communicated my embarrassment to a groom of the headmaster's. The groom swore he would do anything I wished, and when the time arrived went upstairs to bring the trunk down. This, I feared, was beyond the strength of any one man. However, the groom was a man of Atlantean shoulders, fit to bear the weight of mightiest monarchies, and had a back as spacious as Salisbury Plain. Accordingly, he persisted in bringing down the trunk alone, whilst I stood waiting at the foot of the last flight in anxiety for the event. For some time I heard him descending with slow and firm steps, but unfortunately, from his trepidation, as he drew near the dangerous quarter, within a few steps of the gallery, his foot slipped, and the mighty burden falling from his shoulders gained such increase of impetus at each step of the descent that on reaching the bottom it trundled, or rather leaped, right across, with the noise of 20 devils, against the very bedroom door of the Archididascalus. My first thought was that all was lost, and that my only chance for executing a retreat was to sacrifice my baggage. However, on reflection I determined to abide the issue. The groom was in the utmost alarm, both on his own account and on mine, but, in spite of this, so irresistibly had the sense of the ludicrous in this unhappy contretemps taken possession of his fancy, that he sang out a long, loud, and canorous peal of laughter, that might have wakened the 7 sleepers. At the sound of this resonant merriment, within the very ears of insulted authority, I could not myself forbear joining in it, subdued to this, not so much by the unhappy etortery of the trunk, as by the effect it had upon the groom. We both expected,